your reading of Freud is sort of, I think you're reading him through Žižek. And I'm not saying that that is wrong. I definitely appreciate that, and I appreciate it because I understand it more because of that. So like the way Žižek describes the death drive in Less Than Nothing, at least, is it is this it is the primordial act of the subject. I think he will later, he wrote a whole other book called Absolute Recoil, where he actually describes what this act is. It is the absolute recoil. So there's just
Great
this
book as
abs
well. I love that book. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, I do too. Yeah, so there's the absolute recoil, and it is this as Peter explained, definitely better than I can. It is the drive for the enacting of the loss itself. It is not a search for the object, but an enacting of the loss itself. And I think that it can be put in the form of a question as well. And I think in terms of subjectivity, the question is fundamentally, um, who am I? We can maybe say, or what am I? Because even for Zizek, he says that the subject tries to represent itself, it fails, and the subject is the very result of this failure of its own representation. So what you're having, that right there is the death drive. It is the enactment of the failure, which generates a sort of virtual excess, which is object A. That is and the object A is imaginary, and it is for Zizek the most basic level of the imagination is the object A. And at this level, in terms of the very core of the subject itself, the object A is actually the sort of correlate of the void of the subject. It is the inscription of the subject within the symbolic order as the whole in the symbolic order itself. In any case, the way I understand this is that I think Zizek is, I said this earlier, he is correctly um, articulating and intuiting the fundamental impossibility of any self-relation, of any of a unity of identity that is purely self-referential, such as the I equals I of the traditional Cartesian cogito. Obviously, Zizek really problematizes this understanding and sees the cogito as like this inhuman, inherently split thing. And the way I understand, so the way I understand this, the object A in particular, is I have a quote from Saint Maximus the Confessor where he talks about the result of sin. So I would say that the description of the death drive, I think, is the perfect description of sin. It is the attempt to self-relate in the mode of a failure because it always is a failure. Sin always fails to be what it wants to be. Just ontologically, this is sort of the Christian claim. Now, I had a quote from trying to find it here, Saint Maximus the Confessor, where he talks about a sort of virtual excess that is the result of sin, which I think correlates very well with this object A, which is the virtual excess of the death drive. So, Saint Maximus says, that he's talking about those who in the coming life, so at the judgment, they will receive the dreadful condemnation of being estranged from relation with God for infinite ages, a sentence so distressing that the soul will not be able to contest it, for it will have as a perpetually relentless accuser its own disposition, which created for it a mode of existence that in fact did not exist. So I think even in Maximus, you have this dimension of subjectivity, of the purely imaginary, of this pure appearance that Zizek talks about. And I would sort of link this sort of the pure appearance as the result of sin, which are imaginations that in the end, when God is revealed all in all, these imaginations are destroyed in the end. But part of our sort of history, part of what it means to be a being in time, I think, where we're not fully united with God, is we still have yet to fully see the objectivity of the world in the absolute yet. So we have the space is open for the creation of these imaginary realities, which, as Maximus says, do not in fact exist. And I think the essence of this non-real, purely virtual existence is the purely self-posited, of course, in the form of a failure of of the death drive, which I think is the essential structure of all sin. And ultimately, as I was saying, all sin is pride. I think I was saying that earlier. The pride is corresponds to this structure of the death drive, and I would want to articulate that probably somewhere else, maybe in writing before I try to verbalize it. But I'm not sure.
So
By the
you're saying
way,
all the
my
best
my
stuff. You're
yeah,
you're you're kind of I really like what you're doing. Like in one sense, you're reading very carefully Žižek and Lacan and others, and you're kind of saying these people describe incredibly well our current uh, mode of being in the world. And then
right.
what you do is you go. So it's like I'm imagining there's an old story in Belfast where a guy American comes over, gets on the bus and says, "Listen, I'm going to Belfast. What stop do I get off?" And this guy Seamus says, "Oh," he says, "Mate, listen, just look at where I get off, right? Look at where I get off and get off the stop before me." Right. And that's what I feel you're doing. You've gone all the way with Shizek. You've gone all the way. And then you get off the stop before somehow, which which I like. But it's like, yes, the difference between you and I at the moment is you take all of that, but then so for me, again, it's like where for me, sin or negativity is well, sin is I say the repression or foreclosure or disavowal of negativity.
Mhm.
And for you it is drive. So in other words, for me, death drive is constitutive. Death drive, and for you,
Right.
death drive is ultimately able to be overcome.
Right. And
Yeah.
I'm not sure how I would understand, like uh, I'm not sure where exactly it fits in within like a Christian theology of sin, but I was going to say this earlier. The way I see it, I sort of see it as a potential within the subject. So I think what Zizek sees it as is the actual core, the void of the subject, which is just sort of obscured by the fact that we are like actual persons like with egos in a symbolic world. We very rarely confront sort of our own inner negativity. Um, but for Zizek, this negativity, this void, this inhuman void that destroys all substantial content, um, it is uh it is actualized at the core of the subject. While what I would want to say more so is that Žižek is philosophically articulating a potential of subjectivity. As free beings created in the image of God, I think there's this potential for absolute withdrawal. And I think this potential is only ever actualized in hell as Gehenna, that as a moment of consciousness. So I don't actually think it is the core of our subjectivity because I don't see it as constitutive. And this is sort of like the main disagreement, as you were saying.